A lot of these skills, trades, and crafts we brought with us from Africa. A lot of these skills, trades, and crafts we brought with us from Africa. And we've talked about this in our coverage dealing with what's going on in Florida and the suppression of the teaching of African-American history in Florida by the Florida Department of Education and Governor Ron DeSantis. We talked about these new social studies standards coming out of Florida, which teach to middle school students that in some cases enslaved Africans were able to use skilled trades that they learned to their benefit. But we didn't have to be put into an apprenticeship program. We didn't have to be kidnapped and enslaved to be put into an apprenticeship program. As this article and numerous other articles and historical information shows, this piece here from the Washington Post by Jillian Brockel, July 24, 2023, as this details, the name of the article, Note to Florida and DeSantis, enslaved Africans were already skilled. African people when we came here, we brought skills with us. Now, it's also important to note, yes, African people are the original people in North, Central, to South America. You read the book, The First Americans Were Africans, Documented Evidence by Dr. David Imhotep, who's a friend of mine. I've interviewed him about 13 times. His book thoroughly documents this. We deal with this in our classes also. We were in this land before Native Americans even came into existence. And the Khoisan, who come from Southern Africa, who have the oldest DNA on the planet, the short-statured Africans. We know the Khoisan, we're here going back at least 51,700 years ago. But in this article, it talks about historical facts. Africans already were skilled before they were enslaved. And in some cases, enslavers sought and purchased people coming from specific African societies based on skills common in those societies. Decades of research, slave ship manifests, plantation ledgers, newspaper articles, letters, journals, and archaeological digs by dozens of scholars support this, much of it compiled in the 2022 book, African Founders, How Enslaved People Expanded African Freedom, by Pulitzer Prize winning historian David Hackett Fisher. Transatlantic slavery was an economic model proposing that skilled laborers who were benefiting themselves and their communities be abducted, transported, and forced to use those skills to benefit others. Other skills such as literacy, ministry, and music making were often banned because they did not benefit and even threaten the enslaver. Hackett Fisher, David Hackett Fisher explains how in the mid-1700s, enslaving colonists in the low country of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida, Florida once again, enslaving colonists in the low country of the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida targeted people from the windward coast of West Africa, where rice had been cultivated for thousands of years, In the low country, enslaved African people then built complex systems of canals, levees, floodgates, and fields, just as they had in West Africa, providing the region with its first massive cash crop, because we came from very sophisticated civilizations. And we used our skills, trades, and crafts that we had in those civilizations to build those civilizations. Then we used them here to build America. But there were African people already here when the Spanish come in 1513, when the English come in 1607. So there were already African people here. In New England, the Puritans targeted Akan-speaking people from the Gold Coast, or Ghana, what we call Ghana, who had a long military tradition emphasizing discipline and quick thinking. Also, an enslaver named Onesimus, I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce his name, Onesimus, Onesimus, taught Puritan leader Cotton Mather a technique for smallpox inoculation, which he said was common in African homeland. Now, history.com has an article dealing with this because we were inoculating ourselves from smallpox in West Africa. All right. Read the rest of this article here. Note to Florida and DeSantis, enslaved Africans were already skilled. Enslaved Africans were already skilled. Okay, let's go back quickly here to the PowerPoint presentation. So how you all like this type of information? Hopefully you're learning a lot, because this is a lot of research. I got 10 pages of notes, PowerPoint presentation. There's a lot of research to put this together. So we have labor unions being created largely to lock African Americans out of the jobs we were doing for free. And a lot of these jobs are going to go to white immigrants coming to this country and white people who are already here. It was the enslaved Africans who had the majority of the skills in this country. There were at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that we had in this country from 1619 to 1865. And we were largely working for free. Now, the book by James Newton and Ronald Lewis, which came out in 1978, called The Other Slaves, Mechanics, Mechanics, Artisans, and Craftsmen. It details at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that we had in this country from 1619 to 1865. All right. And I saw, now I read different sources that had a portion of these skills, trades, and crafts. But at the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History, there's a, when you go through the main display called And Still We Rise, there's a, when you come out on the other side of it, there's a display, and it shows, it's a display on the wall, and it shows these different skills, trades, and crafts that we had. Okay. And I saw it some years ago. This is probably about 10 years ago now that I saw it. And there's a sign there that says you can't take pictures. Okay. So I went home, got a pen and pad, went back and spent an hour writing them down, and I numbered them. So that's how I know that there are 262 of them, because they weren't numbered in the display. And I have the handwritten copy of it somewhere here in my notes and all my copies of the different indictments against Donald Trump and the timeline of history that we use in my Saturday class. I've got the, where the hell was that? We have it here somewhere. I've got binders full of the articles that we use in the class, so I don't know where the heck it is now. I had it here. Hold on, where the hell is that? I had it recently. It was, I gotta find it. I don't know where it is. It's somewhere around here. Gotta clean up the office. What is this here? Is this? That's not it. Well, it'll turn up. Let me see what this is. Okay, but anyway, let's continue because this is going longer than I wanted it to go. But anyway, it's around here somewhere. Okay, this is all stuff on Reconstruction and stuff from the Sunday class. All right. But we were anchor makers. We were artists, bakers, brick makers, barrel makers, bartenders, basket makers, beer makers, blacksmiths, bricklayers, brick makers, cabinet makers, cigar makers, etc., hemp baggers. A lot of these skills we brought with us from Africa. We were jockeys as well, because we were jockeys during slavery, and then after slavery ends, we're going to dominate the Kentucky Derby. We're going to dominate horse racing. The first Kentucky Derby ran in 1875, and it was won by a former slave named Oliver Lewis. He was 19 years old, okay, when the first Kentucky Derby ran. How many people know this? Okay, so this is some deep history that is oftentimes left out of the history books. This is, so 13 of the 15 jockeys in the first Kentucky Derby were African-American men. I did a lecture back in 2019 called When Black Men Dominated Horse Racing. When Black Men Dominated Horse Racing. And let's see here. I'm just going to show you something quickly here from the presentation, because it's dealing with this period of history here. Okay, so this is Oliver Lewis. So why were horse racing was a pastime for wealthy white people? Usually, poor white men weren't into horse racing. They weren't gambling on horse racing, things like this, right? They didn't own horses. They didn't own thoroughbreds. Poor white men. So why did African American slaves become jockeys? African American jockeys' dominance in the world of racing is a history nearly forgotten today. Their participation dates back to colonial times when the British brought their love of horse racing to the New World. Founding fathers, or as Dr. Francis Cress Welsing called them, the Foundling Fathers, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson frequented the track. And when President Andrew Jackson, who's a huge white supremacist, who's the favorite president of another white supremacist president named Donald John Trump, former president, indicted co-conspirator Donald John Trump. When President Andrew Jackson moved into the White House in 1829, he brought along with him his best thoroughbreds and his black jockeys. So Andrew Jackson hated African people, but he liked us enough. He was nice enough to let us race his horses for him. Because racing was tremendously popular in the South, it is not surprising that the first black jockeys were slaves. Now, this is a picture of Oliver Lewis here. But when the first Kentucky Derby ran in 1875, May 17th, 1875, 13 of the 15 jockeys were African Americans. Among the first 28 Kentucky Derby winners, 15 of them were African American jockeys. African American jockeys excelled in the sport of horse racing in the late 1800s, but by 1921 they had disappeared from the Kentucky track and would not return until Marlon St. Julian rode in the 2000 race. So the last African American jockey to win the Kentucky Derby was Jimmy Wink Winkfield in 1902. He won it in 1901 and 1902. This is Oliver Lewis. Oliver Lewis won the first Kentucky Derby in 1875. Okay, he was 19 years old. He was a former slave, and his